Hello again, Dan Alasso, Making History. And as I was out on my last walk, I was listening to the first half of Lex Fridman's 4-hour-long epic podcast discussion with the economist Saifedean Ammous. And I listened at 1.5 speed, so I did manage to get through about exactly the first half of it while I was walking the 5.25 miles. And as I was walking and listening, I had some thoughts, and I recorded some reactions to what I was hearing. And these responses were possibly more about what the discussions made me think of than they necessarily were accurate descriptions of what the two speakers were actually saying and what these two people may actually believe. So I want to give them the benefit of the doubt as far as that goes. But even if Ammous's descriptions are oversimplifications for the purpose of answering Lex's questions quickly and in relatively simple language, I do think that some of the points that he makes are relevant to understanding the ways that economics, and even Austrian economics, which actually is kind of my favorite flavor, tends to oversimplify the world and sanitize economic power. Early in the discussion, Ammous suggests, somewhat offhandedly, that Lebanon and Zimbabwe and Venezuela have all had kind of historically crappy currencies and economic systems because of some type of flaw in their stock and flow ratios. And this seems to me to kind of deliberately ignore colonialism in both its classical sense of overseas empires and also in its more recent economic forms. So that led me to wonder, is Ammous saying that the reason that the pound sterling or the US dollar were historically the world's de facto currencies, was that simply because these were the hardest currencies of the time with the best stock and flow ratios? That imperial power had nothing to do with it? Is it just a coincidence that the current de facto world currency just happens to belong to the nation with the world's biggest military budget? And again, I don't want to put any words in his mouth, but this difficulty that even Austrian economics has, grappling with the realities of how economic and political and military power are sort of intertwined and reinforce each other, seems to me to be a fairly big flaw in economics. Ammous then says that the Keynesian, what he calls hucksterism, is mostly about creating inflation to feed people's insatiable desire to consume, and that basically everybody wants to buy a Ferrari. And this strikes me as kind of a very privileged upper middle class thing to say. Most people in the world have much more modest economic wants, which oftentimes reflect actual needs. Even in the US, nearly 2/3 of Americans now live paycheck to paycheck, according to some recent polls. So it's really not that much about Ferraris. Many people are trying, some of them rather desperately, to accumulate enough money each week to feed themselves and their families, or each month to pay their rents. And it occurred to me while I was walking and listening that maybe one of the points of this Keynesian desire to add money into the money supply has to do with the fact that as wealth is concentrated, money tends to leave circulation and become tied up in the illiquid assets of wealthy people, like yachts and Ferraris and mansions and bearer bonds and art, things like that. And this leaves even less money available in the economy for wages and groceries and rent payments. Adding to the money supply might be the Keynesians' way of kind of allowing the economy to continue to chug along while the super rich continue to sequester a lot of this money in these illiquid assets. In a way, this is kind of Weasley, right? This is a way of avoiding taxing the rich. And maybe the justification for this is as this money becomes illiquid, it's not inflationary because it's in these fixed assets. And so you can add to the money supply without creating inflation, at least in the short term. And of course, Keynes is famous for saying that in the long run, we're all dead. By the second or third time that Ammous returned to the Ferrari metaphor, I decided it was worth noting that the point may not really be that a rich individual, like himself, has to choose between a Ferrari and other uses for his money. If we step back a bit, the real point may be that from society's perspective, the choice of some rich guys to buy Ferraris may have a direct impact on the ability of some poorer guys and women to feed their families, especially if we want a world of hard money, where the supply of dollars can't really be arbitrarily increased without inflationary consequences. Also, I don't disagree with them that, in theory, central planning is always coercive. This is the classic go-to line of the Austrian school, of course. The road to serfdom argument, that state power is ultimately a gun to your head, and that a free market is not. Governments use their power to compel some actions and to prevent others. For example, if a government decided to outlaw smoking because it not only killed the smokers, but drove up the overall costs of healthcare and had a negative impact on society at large, Ammous would object. But that position sort of assumes that people are not being coerced in any other ways. It assumes that the free market cannot, by definition, be coercive, which is a claim that I don't really agree with. Concentrated economic power can limit the choices of these supposedly free agents in the markets, either as employees or as consumers. Marketing, placement, monopoly power, and even algorithms can all manipulate people's behaviors, oftentimes without their knowledge. There are lots of ways in which people's choices are constrained in free markets. While this may not exactly be a gun to the head, I would question how much different it is sometimes in practice. The argument for some type of government intervention is to mitigate these coercions and to lessen their negative effects. Actions that may make perfect economic sense from the perspective of a profit-maximizing oligarch. For example, hey, let's get Americans addicted to opioids. This type of decision, although it makes economic sense from that standpoint, might be deemed sociopathic by society and might be banned by the government. And the way they would ban it would be with that metaphorical gun to the head. I do find it a bit obnoxious and a bit reductive that Ammous insists that everything done at the point of a gun is morally unacceptable, and that since government holds the monopoly on force, it's the only source of problems that we have to worry about. This seems so patently false in today's world of Amazon and Facebook and Google, with their asymmetric access to information and their overwhelming monopoly power. But even in the era of his own heroes, the original Austrians, like Boehm Bawerk and von Mises, how true is this really? Early in the First World War, by 1915, Thomas Lamont had articulated and had probably already begun implementing his plan to make New York banks, led by J.P. Morgan and Company, the center of the world financial system. The House of Morgan certainly influenced U.S. foreign and domestic policy, even though it was the government, technically, that held the gun to people's heads, drafted men into the war, and imprisoned dissenters like Eugene V. Debs. And then Lamont is also central in 1919 at Versailles at the negotiations that ended the war, that resulted in huge German reparations, which incidentally allowed Great Britain and France to repay their debt to J.P. Morgan and Company. Later, Ammous argues that public utilities should not be publicly owned, that the market can and should decide whether there is one big centralized power plant or many smaller decentralized ones. In this description, he completely ignores the central role that government already plays in that decision via licensing and regulation. This seems like a critical misstatement of the situation, whether it's deliberate or just accidental. It's not a choice, really, between privately owned and publicly owned utilities. It kind of amounts to a tricky, hidden protectionism that grants government monopolies to utilities. Not only power, but other things like cable companies and cell phone carriers, wherever there's a perceived natural monopoly. In other words, this really isn't a choice between free market capitalism and socialism. It's a kind of propagandistic use of free market rhetoric to uphold something which, when Italy and Germany did it in the 1930s, we used to call fascism. Because remember, fascism is not only about scapegoating minorities, it's also about creating this very tight relationship between industry, which does remain private, and the government. Now, I'm not sure that Ammous supports fascism, although he does later try to make a kind of a strange case for monarchy. But I do suspect that it means that we need to watch out, because something like Austrian theory probably could be used as a cover for fascism. Throughout the first half of the podcast, Lex asks some really good questions about things like local optima and domains in which government action might make more sense than entirely unregulated markets. And I think part of the answer to some of these questions is that when the market is set free to operate entirely on its own, a couple of things typically happen. First, as I already mentioned, the market tends to be captured by powerful organizations that accumulate economic power. And I suspect it doesn't really make that much difference to the victims of these organizations whether they are privately owned rather than governmental. Secondly, and I think this is important, because there isn't the same type of public forum that's afforded by democratic governance, or the same type of scrutiny of the decisions of private companies that would happen in that type of public forum, a lot of these decisions tend to be made in the shadows, without people being able to choose, and also without people being able to apply values other than economic costs and benefits to the decision-making process. Lex is absolutely right that people being voted out of office for not representing the interests of their constituents is a legitimate mechanism by which the public can weigh in on these decisions. Of course, government is corruptible, as we have seen all too often recently. But I don't think that the obvious conclusion is that government is necessarily corrupt and that business is incorruptible. He goes on, as I said, to make a case for monarchy. The first king, he says, is typically just and noble. Sometimes, unfortunately, his children and grandchildren, growing up in luxury, fail to develop the adequate sensibility or the appropriate work ethic. But at least they have a longer time horizon than a president who only serves for 8 years. As a historian, I would only add that very often the first so-called good king in a dynasty gains his position in war against an external enemy of the nation. How is this going to work exactly in a globalized culture and a global economy? And Ammus's suggestion that wars rarely happened under the gold standard is absurd. Most of history's wars did happen before fiat currency was invented as such. In the 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, Great Britain went massively into debt in order to win. And then they taxed the colonies in ways that led to the American Revolution. So at the very least, his argument about hard and soft currencies needs to incorporate debt in a much more sophisticated way. It might be interesting, actually, to compare Ammus's thoughts in the Bitcoin standard and the fiat standard to David Graeber's thoughts in Debt, the first 5,000 years. To give him some credit, though, as I conclude, I really love the idea that he proposes that the process of civilization can be defined as a decrease in our time preference, meaning an increasing valuation of the future and an increasing willingness to plan and save and work and invest for a better tomorrow. I do think that's a very hopeful way to think about human progress. So, I will probably have more to say about the second half of this when I take another long walk and listen to it. In the meantime, I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening. I will see you again very soon.